Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. It's so nice to see so many folks joining from really all over the world, seeing all kinds of interesting time zones. So we're really grateful to have a few moments of your time to sort of deliver an update on admissions. Carley and I are very, very grateful for your time, and so we're looking forward to sort of taking you through it. Um, as always, it's been an interesting year. We always sort of think that, maybe things will calm down, but Carly, as we saw this year, it was another very, very
It's
bizarre.
even wilder.
Yeah,
Even wilder than usual.
yeah, it's been a very interesting year nonetheless, but we're very grateful for everybody's time. So, this year, listen, more applications to more schools in almost every case. So we continue to see students utilizing the Common App, utilizing the UC app, utilizing other application platforms, and what that really has meant is kids just wanting to spread the risk across more schools. And that is creating real challenges in the ways that students are evaluated, and just the flow in terms of the way universities are able to respond. And almost in every case, we saw at the large public universities, Texas, Wisconsin, Michigan, almost all of them asking for more time because they had more applications.
They
Um,
just don't have the resources to go through all of those numbers.
That's right. That's right. And so, that was frustrating for a lot of our kids this year. We'll talk a little bit about the shifting landscape that affects the admit rates. We'll talk about test optional and the test policies. It's very, very interesting to see the data now, as colleges are becoming a little bit more transparent. So Carly, we'll chat a little bit about, what are we telling kids as you go into this next cycle, SAT, ACT, which one should you test? How do you test? And thinking through that. And then, we'll talk a little bit about some of these non-traditional paths, which, 4 or 5 years ago were sort of at the start and now have really ramped up. And there's a number of schools that are looking at ways to increase the number of people they can admit, but doing it in non-traditional ways.
Which is actually really exciting.
Yeah, it is really exciting. It gives kids more flexibility, but also brings more questions. And so
Yes,
it'll
that's
be
true.
great. It'll be great to kind of hear from you, Carly, on how you're addressing those needs with students. So let's sort of get into it. And listen, nothing really shocking here. Carly, NYU, USC, Berkeley, Texas, Michigan, all the big names saw significant increases in the number of kids applying. And so I think the question here is, when you're sitting down with those students going into that senior year, like we did with the group that's now just graduated, how are we even having the conversation around student lists and managing the student list? Because you can't apply to 30 or 40 schools and do it well, but you want to also make sure that you're sort of rounding it out. And so, like, what are you hearing from kids and families as you sort of start that process again?
Yeah, so especially this year, what's interesting about the schools on this page here are that the only one that offers ED or that offered ED this past cycle was NYU. So these other schools are highly selective, have so many applicants, and there's no way to increase your chances there through ED. So the best shot at these schools are, so it really depends by school. Some of them offer early action. For a few of these schools, it's really about aligning your interest and aligning your major selection. So especially for Cal Poly, especially for Texas, that's the strategy there. But really considering the acceptance rates for each of these schools based on major, and where that actually puts this school in terms of a target safety or a reach. No surprise here, none of these schools are safety schools. So Cal Poly slow, maybe like it has definitely changed over the years, but is probably the most for all of these schools, especially the most it changes the most based on the major that you choose. But it's also a school where you're going to be kind of stuck in your major. So students have to be careful of trying to rig that game a little bit too much too.
Right, right. So, the curious thing here is that it's not just, the numbers increasing at the big name schools like we saw on the previous slide, we are starting to see a trend of these more regional universities becoming really competitive and powerhouses. And, these are just two examples: Santa Clara, which is here in Silicon Valley, and Wake Forest, which is in the South, and Winston-Salem. And, these are two schools that have, for the most part, been, great academic institutions, wonderful places to go to school, great cultures, great sports, and great campuses, but have been primarily regional campuses. But, if you look at sort of the growth in the applications over the last, 4 to 5 years, it's been very, very significant. These schools have now become incredibly competitive and are getting more competitive. And, we like to say here in Silicon Valley that, Santa Clara is on the same trajectory that Georgetown has been. And so you really have to take a forward-looking view that, you shouldn't be worried about what the acceptance rate to that university is today. You should be thinking about the selectivity of that university over the next 5 or 10 years. And, mark my words, in 10 years' time, we will think of Santa Clara as Georgetown in terms of competitiveness. So it just sort of gives you an idea. We could put 5 or 6 more on this slide, and Carley and I would show you that the trend isn't sort of, a one-off. They are schools all over the country that have been regional brands that are really now becoming national brands.
A
Um,
really big one is Miami right now. This huge trajectory upward. And so just the way that you approach those schools, like Billy was saying, it's really important to keep that in mind and to keep in mind where it's going.
Carley, another banner year for the UCs. It doesn't seem like, despite all sort of larger macro challenges that the UC faces in terms of budgetary issues and, just number of students and being able to service those students, and sort of the question around quality and quantity, at the rate that, a in-state tuition or pays for a UC education so competitive, it's just continuing to drive large numbers. UCLA, again, not just the most applied to school in the United States, but the most applied to school in the world.
Go
140
Bruins.
145,000 undergraduate, doesn't even count the graduate school admissions either. So when you're sitting down with folks and having a conversation about the UCs, how are you framing that? Because hasn't it become a bit of a lottery?
It is the way that I frame it is that the UCs, I'll frame it in a little bit nicer terms than a lottery. How's that? The UCs are very much driven by some things that you can't change, right? So by your zip code, by your school, by your demographics, other than things that they're not allowed to necessarily take in anymore. But all of those things are a big part of your admission at a UC or at a Cal State. So that's something even more so at Cal States, because you really just, that's all they have is your numbers. So there are very specific things that you want to focus on to make yourself stand out. A lot of that happens much earlier in the process, though. So that course selection, making sure that you have not just the basics of the A through G's. If you only have the basics of the A through G's, you have no shot of getting into UCLA, especially if you're from a wealthy area. You have no shot at UCLA. And so that's really something to think about. I also talk to my students about the essays are very specific to the UCs, and also AP test scores. So while the UCs don't take, they are test blind, so they don't take SAT or ACT scores, they absolutely do take AP scores. And so that's really beneficial for UCs, and also major selection. And then a big thing too is I will often have kids that just want to apply to UCLA or just want to apply to Berkeley. And I almost always try to talk them into adding more UCs, because it's the same amount of work no matter what, whether you apply to one or all of them. And it does not impact your chances of admission to UCLA if you add another UC to your application.
Yeah, that's great advice. I mean, listen, that's great advice across across the board. What I sort of wrestle with my students is, if you're going to do the work, you might as well, spread the
Yeah.
risk over the majority of the UCs, because they don't have early decision or early action. This is sort of like a no-brainer. Like, why wouldn't you apply? And then the other piece then is, really trying to, like you said, align the majors, with, the areas that are less impacted. That's not to say that you should, apply as a Russian history major if you are more focused on political science, but you've got to dig deep in terms of like what your
But
interest.
maybe public affairs,
There you go. Exactly. So
something like that.
it's
Yeah.
about being creative. Like, there's only so many econ majors that, any one school can take, or how many bio majors. So, but the reality is, despite all of the interesting sort of macro things going on in the world and here in California, the UCs remain an incredibly diverse and desired location. 136,000 kids apply to UC San Diego.
That's
Probably socially,
crazy.
probably socially one of the more boring schools in California, but still, being in San Diego, an amazing bioscience school, 136 kids applied. K, that's a testament to a really, really competitive environment. But California is not seeing the only growth. Texas, 48% increase in out of state.
Crazy.
People in Austin are starting to refer to it as Southern California too. And the reality is, I think there's been a lot of focus on UT specifically because of the quality of the education, the perceived value in an out-of-state sort of experience for students from the Midwest, from the West Coast, from the East Coast, and also the big time sports, and Austin sort of being a destination for corporate America now. So, that's all led to, a huge number of applications and 48% increase in out-of-state kids, a lot of them coming from California. But really no different at UVA, at Michigan. These are schools that are firmly national brands. They are schools that are incredibly competitive from an academic standpoint, offer a wide range of majors, and they just don't seem, Carly, to be losing in popularity. I think if I looked at my group of seniors from last year, almost all of them applied to at least two
I,
of these. Yeah.
I
Uh,
agree. Yeah. At least two of those plus UNC. Another thing about that too is that they can those are schools that you can apply to with REA also. So restricted early action.
that's right.
Top
That's right.
top public schools.
Um, that being said, um, at the more competitive schools, there doesn't seem to be sort of a lift yet. Now, in some cases, we'll show you there was some benefit in schools going back to requiring tests and not making it slightly easier. But when you look at a school like Boston College, which is an incredibly, competitive Jesuit university, dropping to 12.6%, that is a selective university. NYU, 7.7%. Duke, it's the lowest ever at 4.8%. I mean, these are incredibly competitive schools, and sort of the shifting nature of more kids applying to more schools, these folks are benefiting from that. And I think the one common thread here, Carly, is when you look at these three, you really have to identify, is one of these your top choice? Because if it is, you really have to apply early decision, or you're in for a really, really
Absolutely.
battle. And so, curious on how you think through that process, just generally for a second on ED, in terms of, okay, guys, listen, there's a little bit of gamesmanship here in game theory. For example, you could apply early decision one to Duke, and NYU and BC both have ED2, a second round of ED. So, maybe you play your cards by doing Duke ED, even though it's the most competitive, but then ED2 at the other places. So just talk through that for a second.
Absolutely. So for students with these types of schools on their list, I always go into the fall with an ED and an ED2 option. We always prepare for that. I mean, the acceptance rates are so low that these schools are going to be reaches no matter what for any student. So we go into it with the realistic mindset that you need a backup plan, multiple backup plans, right? That's why we have a regular list. That's why we apply regular. But we look at your stats, your test scores, your GPA, your overall application, and look at what your chances are at these schools and make a plan based on that.
Yeah, that's great advice. In some cases, we did see good news. And, this is probably a benefit due to these schools going back to requiring testing. Some of the political narratives going on in the short term have caused a little bit more scrutiny around some of the schools. And so that, you saw less applications and a slightly higher acceptance rate. So all good news. But when you're talking about the difference of, 3.86% to 4.2%, it's not exactly anything to celebrate. These still remain incredibly, competitive institutions. But I think what it's been highlighted is that even the best institutions in the United States are not necessarily immune to sort of the larger macroeconomic trends and political landscape. And we are going to see in the next round, what that means for applicants from international students into the United States as that sort of remains in flux. I think the long-term zoom out is that applying as an international student still will remain a positive for universities and for applicants who are qualified. But there may be a short-term blip where the number of applicants goes down, because of sort of the perceived, well, maybe I'm not going to be welcomed, or maybe I'm not going to be able to get a visa. But having spent the last 4 and 5 days in our London office meeting with a bunch of our international families, I was, really interested to see that there still remains a high percentage of those international students and U.S. passport holders abroad who are like, yep, this is a short-term blip. I understand it. It's not great, but I'm going to continue to apply. So goes to show that, these schools will see fluctuation as we saw at Yale and Columbia, but, it's pretty minimal. Standardized testing. Okay, Carley, this has been the area where, I like could go just go off on these universities.
Oh,
Like the way they have sort of bumbled, COVID test optional and sort of then now this re-entry into test required. It just leads to a lot of confusion for students. So let's sort of like cut through the noise and just arrive at the bullet point headline here, which is, should my son or daughter test? And from what we saw in this last cycle, did that make a difference? And so just your advice on that, because I'm sure every one of your kids is saying to you, Carley, do I need to test? Should I test? And how do I think about that?
I I advise all of my students to at least take diagnostics and try. That's kind of like the easy, that's just the straight answer. I advise all my students to apply, to not shut that door, to keep that option open. One, because these policies have been changing. Two, because, well, and we'll get to that on the next couple of slides. But as you see here, even in test optional schools, and again, we'll get to this later, it greatly benefits your application, and you don't want to put yourself in a position where you don't have options.
Yeah, I think it's all. I think that's the headline. Is
Yeah,
no reason that you should be limiting your optionality. And so at the very least, take the diagnostic, see how you test, take the test, try to submit a score if you can, and it's
yeah,
accretive. But going sort of the I'm gonna approach, if I don't need to take it, I'm not gonna take it. That approach sort of is no longer available and
yeah,
will definitely limit where students can apply to. And so you want to make sure that you're giving yourself optionality, and taking the test is clearly something that is now coming back into favor in a really significant way.
yeah,
Um, I guess the good news here is that kids who, are testing and applying to schools who are requiring tests are starting to see admissions sort of pop back up into a little bit more of a reasonable perspective based on the historical numbers. And so we saw that at Dartmouth. We've also seen that at places where, they went back to requiring tests, and the number of
Brown.
applications, like at Brown,
Hmm.
went back down. And so that is good news. It's sort of an evening out in a more sort of real playing field, because definitely in the heart of the test optional, what we saw over the last few years, and a little bit as it flushed out this year, is, lots of kids were applying who maybe weren't qualified, but because the school was test optional. And again, people often think, oh, well, why should that matter? And it's just a pull on resources. Again, when universities are receiving tens of thousands of applications, it means less time per application that they can read. So this sort of leveling of the playing field in terms of tests being required is a good sign for kids. Um, and as you can see, like sort of, you could even sort of think about this, from a high school perspective as well, where I like at Harvard Westlake this year, I think the number was like 90% of seniors who applied to colleges ended up submitting test scores. Carley, how do you think about, again, with these universities, like, hey, I'm not sure I want to test. I'm not sure I want to test. But with these numbers, it clearly says that the vast majority of the applicants are testing. And so how do you just, just again, from a one-on-one perspective, how do you get kids to sort of push through that and realize that like, all right, I got to do this?
I actually pull these stats up with my students that are fighting me a lot. I feel like, especially in California, because the public schools are test blind, a lot of kids really need to see these numbers. So I will pull these up and I say, look, they say that their policy is test optional, but it's not. Their option, their policy is test preferred. They prefer test scores. They prefer strong test scores. If you take the test and your score is not going to benefit your application, then we can go test optional. But that needs to be the case. You can't just opt yourself out because you are hurting yourself if you don't attempt to submit test scores.
Yep, I think that's good advice. Again, early decision. So, the headline here, folks, is like if a student has a number one choice, and that school offers early decision, that is still the best way statistically. Like it is the most important decision in this process. And by the way, early decision isn't for everyone, but for qualified students looking for selective universities or student athletes, early decision is a really, really key component of this agenda and this process. And so thinking about how you utilize early decision, early action, and then what your regular decision schools is a really, really important process that has to happen sort of in the summer and early fall of one's, sort of senior year. But, make no mistake about it, applying early decision is better. It just is.
So much better.
There is like it's a lot of times people were like, oh, that's hyperbole, or Billy, you're exaggerating. No, it's not. It's not. Early decision rate at Brown 17.9%, regular 5.7, at Duke 12.8 to 3.7. Like those are big swings, and that doesn't mean again that everybody has to apply early decision, but every student should consider it. And they should look at the different rates and talk to their advisor on, is this something for me? Is this beneficial? How does this relate to my strategy? Do the schools that I'm looking for have early decision? And how can I leverage this as a tool? Early action, there's always sort of been this like interesting like bifurcation. At some schools, it's clearly better. Yale's a good example. And Georgetown, is an example of like, it's kind of a push, right? Because of the number of diplomatic admits that they receive in the EA round, going EA is not really that much, helpful. And in some cases, in this case, is actually more competitive than regular. The big question that everybody has this year for Georgetown, which is great news from a process standpoint that they've gone onto the Common App, because their own application for the last 30 years is like horrendous from a technology.
Wonky.
Well, what it is going to mean now is they're going to have way more applicants. And so it's
More.
going to be very interesting to see what that shift does for their EA and regular. But again, sort of this conversation around early decision and early action, and how do I come up with that first group of schools, and thinking through that will remain a really key part of the process for our students moving forward. Deferrals and wait lists, along with like test optional, this is like another great way that the colleges have totally like gamified and sort of thought about how to like leverage numbers and stuff. And the good news here, and I do think it is generally good news, is that if your son or daughter, and we saw this in so many different examples this past fall, if you're deferred in the early round, it's not a polite no. There are
No.
real opportunities to get in after you've been deferred. We saw that at Georgetown. We saw that at Wisconsin. We saw that at Texas. We saw that at Boston College. We saw that at a number of schools this year. And so the important piece there is to sort of like, all right, keep going with the process, continue to work hard on grades, continue to write the updates, continue to be involved. And if you do that, you're putting yourself in a really, really good perspective. And we saw a number of kids, this fall who got deferred, worked hard, stayed focused, and delivered and got in off the wait list. So, the deferrals and wait lists are just a way of colleges mitigating and figuring out their enrollment yield. And so it shouldn't be looked at like, oh, like, this is over. Like it's good news and it's positive news. The longer you stay in the pool, the better chance you have.
And you just keep following up And a lot of those schools too, there's a whole bunch of schools where I just tell kids to just expect the deferral.
Yep.
Expect the deferral if from this school, and get your expectations in line.
Yep. So, one of the big things now that we're seeing, and again, when you see a school like Middlebury starting to offer this, there are universities who are saying, we want to accept more kids, but we're limited to how many beds we have on campus. And so what we're going to do is we're going to invite kids to start their freshman year or, start, their freshman's first semester, and they're going to start, at a different campus. And so, Carly, just talk briefly as we sort of wrap up here, on this in terms of like big picture. We're seeing this at Middlebury, we're seeing it at Northeastern, we're seeing it at USC. But what does this
Yeah.
mean? Why are colleges doing it? And then how do you get the kids? So, we had a number of kids where they got this offer, like, hey, I got accepted to USC, but I got accepted for the spring. I got
Yep.
accepted to SMU, but for the spring. So maybe just talk through a couple of those scenarios.
Yeah. So it's if for a kid, if that's your dream school and that's where you really want to go, spring admit is better than no admit, right? So that's the upside. And the good news too is you're in, you're gonna go, you're gonna graduate from there, it's all great. But you do miss out on that first semester. So there's several different approaches to that. We For each kid, it's different. It's kind of like deciding whether or not to keep waiting on a wait list or not, how much you value that school and how much you want to go to that school. But in a lot of cases, I continue to work with the students and continue to follow up with the schools throughout April, May, and June. And in a lot of cases, you can keep pestering your regional admissions rep and potentially get pushed to fall. So I had several students who were who were deferred and then waitlisted and then spring admits, and then we finally got pushed through to fall. So like Billy was saying earlier, it's not over.
Yeah, I think the issue here is that we look at this as a net benefit for students and
Mhm.
just another sort of layer of expectation in terms of admissions. And so, like in all cases, you consider your options and you think about best fits. But generally these types of schools taking more students is good news. And so having
Yep.
a little bit of an open mind and thinking about that, it doesn't have to be the fall start on the campus. That's not everybody's experience anymore. And so much in higher education has changed in the last decade, 2 decades, that this is just another example. And in many cases, I had a student at the University of North Carolina who did their first semester in Korea, and he came back and said, this was a total game changer. I couldn't have thought about starting college differently. And the relationships that these kids make when they start somewhere with a smaller cohort is a very interesting, very
Yeah, that's
perspective.
something I've seen a lot with the Trojan transfer. So students that study abroad the first year and then go to USC, their growth from studying abroad and being with that small cohort is huge. And honestly, it's it's great for the student, it's great for the university because these students are even more prepared when they start at the university, and it's a really great experience, and like who wouldn't want to go spend a year in Paris? So like Billy was saying, um open up to different ways of spending your first year and getting to where you want to go.
Yep. Listen, it's been always a pleasure to connect with everybody, and we'll be circulating the deck. But I think the high level summary, from this semester in this last round is that we continue to see a lot of selectivity at the top schools. Early action, early decision continue to remain really important in the strategy, and then sort of testing is now back, right? So it's really important to give full consideration to when to test, how to test, and making that a part of sort of the narrative moving forward. And if you don't have to submit a test because your test score is not accretive at a particular university, having that sort of selective score choice and the maximized optionality is generally going to be beneficial to a student. But trying to put your best foot forward is going to be key. And then sort of the macro environment in the world that we live in today means that there's a lot of noise around higher education. There's, obviously what's been happening with affirmative action, with international students, the debate that is happening across the country in terms of the current administration and some of the universities. It's really important to sort of like put the blinders on and focus on
Mhm.
the long term and not what's happening today. And you have to continue to stay focused on your grades, on your extracurriculars, on your testing, on developing the whole person and putting yourself in a place where you can find the right fit, academic, athletic, and social fit. And you don't accomplish that by getting bogged down in the sort of the granularity of what's happening in the political and economic landscape today. So, just urging kids to be very productive this summer, to enjoy this path as they get ready for their senior year. And, we're always very grateful to be on the journey with all of you. Carley, thanks for your time
We
today.
are.
So nice to see everybody, and we look forward to sending out the recap. But thanks again for everybody's time today.
Thanks, everybody. Let us know if you have any questions or if you want to talk about anything specifically.